It happened quietly at first. No press conference. No public explanation. Just closed doors. And sudden distance. 1 week, Erika Kirk was still being seen as a woman of faith protected, supported, and publicly embraced by church leadership. The next, those same leaders had allegedly cut ties, locked access, and gone completely silent. And the timing raised immediate questions. Because this shift didn't follow a long investigation or a public disciplinary process. It came right after a shocking leak surfaced online, a leak that reportedly spread faster than any official response could contain it. What happened behind closed doors that made church leaders move so decisively? Why was there no attempt at reconciliation, explanation, or damage control-only separation? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was this about morality, or was it about liability? Before we go any further, take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel if you want carefully researched true crime stories that separate fact from speculation. And in the comments, tell me, what's your first reaction to this story so far and where are you watching from? Because once you understand who Erika Kirk was to the church, the speed of what happened next becomes even more difficult to ignore. Let's start there. To understand why this separation sent shockwaves through both religious and public circles, you first have to understand who Erika Kirk was within the church before everything unraveled. She wasn't a distant attendee. She wasn't anonymous. And she wasn't on the margins of the community. By most public accounts, Erika was deeply embedded in faith-based spaces. Her religious identity wasn't something she practiced quietly, it was something she presented openly, often publicly, and increasingly as part of her personal brand. She spoke the language of devotion. She referenced scripture frequently. And she positioned herself not just as a believer, but as someone who had clarity about faith, someone disciplined, refined, and spiritually grounded. That image mattered. Because in religious institutions, visibility creates stakes. When someone is known, supported, and associated with leadership, their behavior doesn't just reflect on them, it reflects on the institution itself. And for a long time, Erika appeared firmly inside that protective circle. During periods of personal loss and public attention, the church did not distance itself. Instead, it showed up visibly, publicly, and without hesitation. Religious leaders stood nearby. Congregations prayed openly. The association was clear, which is why the sudden shift felt so jarring. This wasn't a quiet drift away. This wasn't a gradual separation. This was an abrupt break. And when institutions act quickly like that, especially ones known for deliberation and internal process, it usually signals risk. Not emotional risk. Not spiritual disagreement. But reputational and legal exposure. Because once someone becomes a liability, support can turn into silence almost overnight. And that brings us to the moment everything changed, the leak that forced decisions to be made behind closed doors. Long before the public was ever meant to see them. That's where this story takes a turn. The turning point didn't begin with a sermon. It didn't come from a pulpit or a public rebuke. It began online. According to multiple reports, explicit material allegedly connected to Erika Kirk surfaced suddenly, circulating across platforms with alarming speed. This wasn't a vague rumor or a passing accusation. The content was time-stamped, identifiable, and most critically impossible to ignore once it began spreading. What's important here is restraint. There has been no public confirmation from law enforcement. There have been no formal charges announced. And church leadership has not issued an official statement detailing their reasoning. But institutions don't wait for courts when reputational exposure is involved. In cases like this, churches, especially those with public visibility, often act internally and decisively, guided by legal counsel, insurance concerns, and long-established risk protocols. And according to people familiar with the situation, once church leadership became aware of the leaked material, their posture shifted almost immediately. Meetings reportedly happened behind closed doors. Access was allegedly restricted. Communication slowed, then stopped. There was no attempt at public clarification. No internal defense offered on record. Just distance. And that silence spoke louder than any sermon ever could. Because when an institution refuses to comment, it usually isn't confusion, it's caution. At that moment, the issue was no longer just personal conduct. It became about association. Could the church afford to be seen as protective? Could silence be interpreted as endorsement? And if the material continued spreading, would continued affiliation invite scrutiny the institution wasn't prepared to face? Those questions don't get debated publicly. They get answered privately by lawyers, boards, and leadership councils. And when the answers come back unfavorable, the outcome is often the same. Separation. Immediate and firm. But what made this situation even more complicated was the contrast between how Erika was seen before the leak and what the public began revisiting after it. Because once attention shifts, the pastos and hysteried. And that's when older footage long forgotten by many started resurfacing, reframing everything people thought they knew. That's where the narrative began to fracture. From the outside, the response looked like absence. Statements. No clarification. But inside institutional spaces, silence is rarely passive. When controversy reaches a certain threshold, organizations don't debate morality in public. They assess exposure in private. And according to reports surrounding this situation, that's exactly what happened next. Church leadership allegedly moved quickly to limit association. Not through public condemnation, not through dramatic announcements, but through administrative action. Access was reportedly withdrawn, roles and privileges quietly revoked, and communication channels that once felt open became noticeably closed. This matters because churches, especially high-profile ones, do not operate impulsively. Decisions like these typically involve leadership councils, legal advisors, and risk management discussions. And notably, there was no attempt at public restoration, no call for prayerful patience, no announcement of counseling or reconciliation, no message urging the community to withhold judgment. Just distance. That absence suggests the issue wasn't being treated as a temporary moral failure but as a structural threat. In institutional terms, once something becomes a liability that could invite media scrutiny, donor concern, or legal attention, the priority shifts from pastoral care to containment. And that's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because this was the same community that had once stood publicly beside Erika during moments of grief and visibility. The same institution that had embraced her openly now chose separation without explanation. Which raises a critical question. What did leadership see or fear that made continued affiliation no longer worth the risk? That question becomes even heavier when you consider how the public narrative and the private response didn't align. Outwardly, there was no clear accusation. Inwardly, there was decisive action. And when those two realities diverge, It often signals information that hasn't been nor can't be made public. But the institution wasn't the only one responding. As leadership pulled back, the internet surged forward. And that's when the public began re-examining Erika's past, not to understand faith, but to test credibility. As church leadership retreated into silence, a very different conversation was unfolding in public. Because when institutions refuse to explain their actions, the vacuum gets filled not with facts, but with interpretation. Publicly, there was no formal accusation, no written explanation, no stated reason for the separation. Privately, however, the response had already happened. And that disconnect is where speculation thrives. To supporters, the silence felt like abandonment, an institution turning its back without due process. To critics, it looked like quiet confirmation, an organization stepping away before the damage spread. But from an investigative standpoint, both reactions miss a critical reality. When churches face situations involving potential scandal, their decisions are often shaped less by belief and more by risk management. Legal exposure, donor confidence, media optics, and insurance liabilities all become part of the calculation. Which means silence doesn't necessarily signal guilt. And separation doesn't automatically confirm wrongdoing. It signals self-preservation. And yet, for the public watching this unfold, nuance was quickly lost. Because as the church withdrew, Erika's public image didn't fade, it intensified. Her past statements were replayed. Her online presence was dissected. And every previous expression of faith was suddenly reinterpreted through a new lens. What once sounded like devotion now struck some as performance. What once felt disciplined now felt rehearsed. And when perception shifts, people don't look forward, they look back. They search for inconsistencies. They rewatch old footage. They ask whether the image they accepted was ever real to begin with. This is where the public narrative began to diverge sharply from the private one. Inside the institution, silence, caution, containment. Outside of it, amplification, speculation, and re-evaluation. And that re-evaluation didn't start with new evidence. It started with old material resurfaced at exactly the wrong moment. Because once credibility is questioned, history gets reinterpreted. And the past, whether relevant or not, becomes part of the present case. When public confidence cracks, the past rarely stays buried. As attention intensified, older media appearances connected to Erika began resurfacing clips, images, and footage that had existed quietly online for years but were never widely scrutinized until now. It's important to be precise here. None of this material was new. None of it was hidden. And none of it was illegal. But timing changes meaning. Footage from earlier stages of Erika's public life painted a version of her that looked noticeably different from the disciplined, faith-centered persona she later presented. In some appearances, she leaned into a more provocative image, one that clashed sharply with how she was later known within religious spaces. To some viewers, this contrast felt irrelevant. People change, lives evolve, beliefs shift. But to others it raised uncomfortable questions not about morality, but about consistency. Because in public-facing roles, credibility often hinges less on perfection and more on transparency. And that's where the tension deepened. The issue wasn't that Erika had a past. It was that the past and the present seemed to exist in conflict without a clear bridge between them. As these clips circulated, they weren't presented as proof of wrongdoing. Instead, they were used to challenge the narrative Erika had built over time. Critics argued that the image of rigid discipline and spiritual authority didn't fully account for earlier behavior that appeared more fluid, more performative, and more commercially driven. Supporters pushed back, pointing out that growth doesn't require public confession, and that resurfacing old footage during a crisis is a common tactic used to discredit rather than understand. Both perspectives gained traction. But once again, the problem wasn't the material itself. It was the moment it returned. Because when institutions pull away and refuse to explain why, the public searches for answers elsewhere even if those answers are incomplete or misleading. And while the past was being dissected online, Erika herself was not retreating from public life. Instead, her messaging began to shift. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Her tone changed, her language sharpened, and her framing of events suggested that what was happening wasn't discipline but persecution. And that reframing would become central to what came next. As old footage resurfaced and the church remained silent, online attention surged. Suddenly, Erika Kirk was no longer just a figure of faith. She became the center of intense scrutiny. Allegations, speculation, and theories spread rapidly across social media platforms, forums, and comment sections. Some viewers focused on her alleged connections to political figures and high-profile networks. Others speculated about whether the leak itself was strategic, meant to destabilize her influence or reputation. Reddit threads and online discussions tied her name to various rumors, each circulating as a fact, even though none had been verified by official sources. Here's the critical distinction for viewers. Allegations do not equal proof. Many claims remain unconfirmed. Some are hearsay, and some are outright speculation. Yet the sheer volume of discussion amplified public perception and, in some cases, created a narrative that began to feel real, even without legal or factual confirmation. It's also worth noting the psychological effect of repetition. The more footage, old clips, and rumors circulated, the more the public began to assume connections, motives, and intentions that weren't substantiated. This is a common phenomenon in high-profile true crime and scandal cases. Perception often becomes a driving force, sometimes stronger than reality itself. What makes this case especially complex is that these online reactions are layered atop real institutional action. Church leaders did, in fact, distance themselves. That decision, whether motivated liability, caution, or something else entirely, created space for public narratives to form. And once that space exists, speculation grows faster than facts can catch up. So, while Erika's past behavior and the leak triggered institutional distancing, the public began piecing together stories that sometimes contradicted each other, blurring the line between verified events and conjecture. At this stage, it's important to step back and ask, what is confirmed, what remains alleged, and what is pure speculation? Only by separating these layers can an accurate understanding begin to emerge. And as scrutiny intensified, Erika herself did not retreat. Instead, she took a surprising step that would shift attention once again. Once Erika Kirk found herself isolated from the church that had once embraced her, her public presence shifted in a way that was both deliberate and strategic. Her social media, once a mix of personal updates and faith-based content, began emphasizing scripture, biblical references, and teaching moments. Posts and captions positioned her not just as a participant in faith, but as someone interpreting it, guiding it, and instructing others. Even her podcast took on a more structured, authoritative tone, like she was preparing for a larger platform. This is where power, faith, and reputation intersect. Institutions often protect themselves quietly. But individuals in high-profile positions can also take action to control the narrative. Erika's apparent pivot toward public teaching and spiritual leadership served multiple functions. Reasserting authority, establishing herself as someone still relevant, knowledgeable, and connected to faith. Framing perception, turning a moment of vulnerability into a message of persecution and resilience. Building future infrastructure, signaling potential expansion, such as creating her own religious or charitable entities. From a true crime perspective, this is a classic pattern. When public figures face reputational crises, they often respond by reclaiming control, not necessarily because wrongdoing is admitted or denied, but because perception is everything. However, experts and investigators would note that this kind of maneuver can also invite heightened scrutiny. The more visible the response, the more questions arise. Is this about faith or image management? Is the goal spiritual guidance, personal branding, or something more strategic? How much of this is genuinely about belief versus protecting influence and reputation? What makes Erika's case especially complicated is the combination of past scrutiny, institutional distancing, and political or social connections. These layers create a situation where every action, every post, and every statement is analyzed, often by people outside the immediate community. At this point, viewers begin to ask not just what happened, but why, and that's a critical turning point in true crime narratives. The facts of the leak, the institutional response, and the resurfaced past are only part of the story. The larger question becomes, how is power being rebuilt, and who benefits or is protected by this new structure? And as we look at this, the answers remain far from clear. Can understand the story clearly. What we know verified, confirmed. Erika Kirk was previously a visible figure within her church community. Church leadership reportedly distanced themselves from her after material allegedly surfaced online. The leak circulated publicly and drew widespread attention, though there are no official legal confirmations regarding the content. Erika publicly maintained her faith and continued teaching through social media and her podcast. What remains alleged or reported? The nature and origin of the leaked material are unverified. Reports of private discussions, meetings, or church deliberations are based on insider claims, not public records. Alleged connections between Erika, political figures, or broader organizational networks are unconfirmed. What the public speculates? That Erika's actions may represent a strategic attempt to reclaim influence. That resurfaced old footage or past behavior contradicts her current persona. That her new initiatives, including potential religious or charitable projects, might be structured to protect or shield influence, though there is no verified evidence for this. Separating these layers is critical. True crime narratives thrive on clarity, not assumption. Viewers need to know what is fact, what is humor, and where the line is blurred. This distinction also highlights a key pattern in high-profile cases. Public perception can move faster than verified truth. Rumors, resurfaced media, and speculation all influence how the story is received, even when no formal findings exist. So, where does this leave us? Erika Kirk lost the church that once protected her. She faced public scrutiny fueled by resurfaced footage, leaked material, and online speculation. And yet, she did not retreat. She responded, shaping her own narrative, amplifying her message, and signaling that her story was far from over. What we know for certain is limited. Church leaders distanced themselves. Material surfaced online. Erika continues to maintain a public presence and teach faith. What we cannot confirm remains larger. why the church acted when it did, what truly happened behind closed doors, and what motivations, personal, spiritual, or strategic drove each decision. And here's the question that lingers. Is this story about faith? Is it about image, control, or influence? Or is it a combination of all three, layered over decades of public perception and private decisions? For viewers, the truth remains partially hidden just out of reach. And that is where the power of true crime lies. It challenges us to weigh evidence, question motives, and confront uncertainty without easy answers. The story is still unfolding. And as more information comes to light, perspectives will shift once again. If you followed this story closely, now is the time to share your thoughts. Comment below. What do you think really happened behind those closed doors? And where are you watching from? Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more carefully researched true crime stories that separate facts from speculation. Because in the world of high-profile scandals, perception moves faster than truth, and the questions often matter more than the answers.